So I'll say a few words just to kind of shift. And that is, again, the teaching of Psalms has been for me a discovery in that each psalm is far more artistically woven than I had appreciated as a lifetime reader of Psalms. This class is the opportunity to take our time and to look at the choice of words, the structure, and to compare Psalms to each other. This morning is Psalm 15, which means we're at the 1/10 mark in terms of how many Psalms there are. The opening Psalms, particularly the first 40, are often ascribed to David. They are not necessarily written by David or for David, but David was a psalter. David was a singer of psalms of praise of God, and scholars today will debate when psalms were written. Some psalms, for instance, being in reference to a return to Zion, meaning after expulsion. But in a traditional mode, all psalms are David-oriented. The Talmud would say that psalms are to be read three-dimensionally, as a moment in David's life, as an expression of a time of the temple, and then as a time that transcends place and a particular time. Psalm 15, our psalm for today, is a psalm that I frankly know from my work doing funerals. It's not part of our liturgy, but it's one of those psalms in my rabbi's manual, along with Psalm 24. Psalm 15 and Psalm 24 are similar in that many scholars of the Psalms will call them entry psalms. And the question is an entry to what and whether it was actually used. So comment about that. It begins that way with verse 1. A psalm of David, Adonai, who may sojourn in your holy tent, who may dwell on your holy mountain. Not yet, in a moment, Eric. So in that regard, the opening verse seems to be a question to God. Who is worthy of entering into your sacred space? Nahum Sarna, a great Bible scholar, taught at Brandeis and is responsible for the Exodus commentary to the Jewish Publication Society commentary, which has been folded into our Eitz Chaim, has a separate book on Psalms in which he analyzes in one chapters Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. And he says this psalm could well have been used as a test by the Levites, or at least chanted by the Levites, when you got to the Temple Mount. Who is worthy to be here in the sacred space? And he, Nahum Sarna, who's a scholar of ancient literature, looks at those texts from Egypt and Sumeria, where to enter into the world to come, there was a template, a formula of moral qualifications. And yet, other scholars would say there is no historical evidence that there was ever a test to enter into the Temple Mount. In fact, one of the key sacrifices was a sin offering, which is to say, everybody was invited to pray. Everybody was invited to make an offering. This, as we will see in a moment, are 11 moral qualities that weren't necessarily a test in actuality, nor do we have any evidence that these qualities are part of the definition of morality that are to be employed in going to the pearly gates to heaven. So that's a little context for Psalm 15, popular psalm at funerals, but it's not necessarily about entry to the world to come. Instead, it's a description of what it means to be in God's favor. Or if you will, not unlike Psalm 14, in imagining from a human point of view, who is this God to whom I am speaking? What does the God to whom I address expect from human behavior? With that, let me read the psalm with the translations that I have crafted, and then I'll point out some of the artistic symmetry and say a little bit more about this notion of what this psalm says about God. A Psalm 15, which I've entitled Sure-Footed with Integrity. A Psalm of David. Adonai, who may sojourn in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? The person who walks with integrity, who acts justly and speaks truth of heart, who is not slandered with tongue, nor done harm to neighbors, nor wrongly shamed an intimate, in whose eyes a debased person is repugnant, but who honors those who are in awe of Adonai. Though swearing even with self-harm does not renege, who has not given money with interest, nor taken a bribe against the innocent, who acts thusly shall not stumble ever. So let me point out some of the artistry of how this psalm is composed. The opening verse is a question, and there is a sense of increasing qualities of permanence, of closeness to God. The Ohalecha, the tent, refers to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which is also called Ohel Moed in the Bible. A tent is temporary, and likewise the word in Hebrew, the verb yagur, sojourn, has more of a quality of a transient than an ongoing committed relationship. Who may dwell in your holy mountain? That's a classic reference to Har Zion, Mount Zion, or Har Moriah, which is where the sacred temple would be located. And here the verb is yishkon, which is like Mishkan. It's Shechina, feminine quality of God, but there's a greater quality of permanence often in the nuance of yishkon, of dwelling. So the question is, who God may be close to you, who may be privileged to be embraced by your presence. And now with verses 2, 3, 4, and 5, there will be 11 qualities provided, but each verse will focus in on a different body part. So verse 2 focuses on lashon, the tongue. Verse 2 focuses on lev, the heart. Verse 3 focuses on the tongue. Verse 4 focuses on eyes explicitly, and verse 5 implicitly focuses on the hand. Verse 2, to start over, focuses on general qualities of mindset. That's the heart. Heart was understood as both feeling but also thinking in the biblical mode. So this is the mindset. What's that mindset? It's a mindset of tamim. And the word tam I translate as integrity. Others translate it as blameless or innocent. You know, we learn of Noah. Noah ish tamim haya b'doratav. He was either blameless for his time, for his generation. We also hear of Abraham. Hitalech lifanai, God will say to him, walk before me, v'haya tamim, and be tamim. So tam is an attribute. I'm often struck when I went to see cemeteries in Eastern Europe, a popular epitaph on an Eastern European Jewish grave is Tam v'yashar, which can either be simple and straight or I think of it again as with integrity and straightforwardness. So that's the mindset. Verse 2, Holech tamim, walk with tam, walk with integrity, ufo el tzedek, and do justly, do righteousness, v'dover emet bilvavo, and speaks the truth of his heart. Again, with my translations, I've removed the gender. In that sense, it's a bit nuanced. So who speaks truth of heart. So verse 2 is the mindset of this person who, this is aspirational, who is the one who God seeks to embrace. Verse 3, has not slandered with tongue. Rashi understands this as has not engaged in Lashon Hara, and I've chosen to translate verse 3 in the past tense. I've shared in previous classes, we have only two tenses in Hebrew, perfect and imperfect. Perfect is past to present, imperfect present to future. So translators of this psalm with verse 3 have a choice of translating the verbs in the past tense or the present tense. Back to verse 3, this again is focused on speech, and the body part is Lashon, who is not slandered with tongue, nor done harm or evil to others, nor wrongly, not done harm to neighbors, nor wrongly shamed an intimate. I want to say thank you to Eric for his patience. I constantly retranslate as I prepare. So he gets 4 or 5 different, no, this will be the one that you'll, send out. And here, let me tell you with verse 3, some of the nuance. He has not done harm, the middle part of verse 3, lire'ehu. Ohevet re'echa kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So I, at the last moment, chose to change it instead of to others, more specifically to neighbors. And then karovo, which is often translated as neighbors, but is also in modern Hebrew a family member. So in verse 3, in terms of escalating challenge, nor wrongly shamed an intimate. So speaking Lashon Hara is about anybody, done harm to one's neighbors is more close to you, and nor wrongly shamed is an intimate. So there's a sense for each of these, in each verse, there is a triplet going on, and each of the triplets is increasing. Verse 4 deals with eyes, has not debased the person, in whose eyes a debased person is repugnant, who honors those who are in awe of God, and that's the contrast. Though swearing even with self-harm does not renege. So here, there's this quality of calling out bad behavior, honoring good behavior, in terms of what you see as good behavior and bad behavior, and for oneself, having the integrity to stay true to one's promises and oaths, even to self-harm. Last, verse 5, who is not given money with interest. In the Bible, there is no giving of interest, which for us is kind of disoriented. How can you get a loan if they're not giving any interest? So in a biblical mode, it was not a commercial society. The only people who needed to borrow money were farmers who were very poor, maybe for seed or for food. And so the context for borrowing in the Bible overwhelmingly seems to be poverty. And so in that context, there was no giving under Jewish law of money with interest, no taking advantage of the poor. Later on, Jewish law, as it moved into a commercial context, would find loopholes. Even today in Israel, banks have to engage in kind of a legal loophole of becoming partners with the person borrowing to technically be able to lend for interest. So again, Bible is pre-commercial. Who is not given money with interest, which is why Jews could be money lenders in the Middle Ages, because the Catholic Church took this also in the earlier part of the Middle Ages as a biblical directive, so they couldn't engage as they moved toward the Renaissance and commercial trade. Nor taken a bribe against the innocent. This is the relationship of somebody with money to those in power, or somebody who is a judge with power, or a political person with power. For God, throughout Psalms, protecting the poor, creating a level playing field between rich and poor, is the morality that God demands. Last line, who acts thusly shall not stumble. The word yimot is often translated as will stand firm, but I chose to use the word stumble to go back to the opening of verse 2. Holech tamim, the one who walks with integrity, will not stumble. That's the reward. And by the way, it doesn't say that God will give the reward. It can be understood that way. It can be understood as this is what God will give you as the reward. And we will see that in tomorrow's Psalm, Psalm 16, God being at one's right hand, so one will not stumble. But it could also be that's the reward for living a life of integrity. There's a quality of sure-footedness, of stability, of equanimity, and that in itself is the reward. As poetry, both can simultaneously be true. Back to structure. The word no is repeated over and over. It's repeated 6 times as do not do, and then as the last line, and you will not stumble. And the question is, why all these nots as a key motif in the composition? And it's for clarity, some say. You know, it's like Hillel, do not do to others what you would not have them do to you, as the golden rule is sometimes easier to actualize than love your neighbor as yourself, which is much more open-ended. It's more practical when you know what you're not supposed to do, in reference to Hillel's statement. And so some also say here of the psalmist, by having these statements of no slander, no harm, no shaming, there's a quality of clarity. Last comment, and then I'll open it up for reactions. I was teaching on Sunday an Introduction to Judaism class, and the theme that I was given by the text was, tikkun olam. And the word tikkun olam, to repair the world, is really a mystical term of the 16th century onward, of being God's partners and fixing the world. But what is clear throughout the Bible? It's our Torah reading of last Shabbat with Parsha Kedoshim. Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. You shall be holy, for I am the Lord your God, am holy. Psalms throughout have this emphasis on morality. This psalm does not speak about ritual purity. It doesn't speak about how you have related to God as the giver of law. Rather, it's God as parent saying, I need you to model how you are in your everyday life in relationship with my fellow creatures, my children. It's about daily behaviors of morality that define who will come into God's presence for purpose of ritual. It's the Haftorah of Yom Kippur, in which Isaiah says, this is not the fast that I ask for. These are not the offerings that I want. They're repugnant to me because you are immoral in how you treat the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. That what makes Psalms religious is an understanding of God seeking morality in how we live out our daily lives. And that becomes our ticket into God's presence. And so with that, we have about 8 minutes, 10 minutes for you to unmute yourself and to share how this psalm, again, often identified with funerals, strikes me as about how to live life in the here and the now.
I have a question, Ellie.
Yes, Jay.
Hi, good morning, Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
At what point during the funeral would you recite this psalm? I'm curious because I must confess I have not been to many funerals in my life. I have conducted a few, but can probably count them on the fingers of one hand. But so at what point would you read this psalm?
So Jay asks, at what point would Psalm 15 be read? It's often read at the very beginning. And again, in the rabbi's manual, there's 3 or 4 psalms given as recommended psalms to create the setting for honoring the life of a departed. Psalm 15 is one of them that I commonly give to the family to read. And it's a way of honoring through Psalms. My loved one lived a life of integrity. They were a good person in their daily life. But again, verse 1 creates this context as if, this is who's going to enter into my tent. It's as if who's going to go to the next world. And there is an element of that, but the psalmist was probably not speaking of that in the context of writing this psalm. This is about who's worthy or not worthy. Who is it that God seeks to embrace? That's a nice way to frame it. It's aspirational. Once again, the temple is for everybody. It's for the sinner to bring the sin offerings. But we are to be reminded in coming into God's presence of who we would want to be at our best. And the Talmud in Makot will say these 11 qualities of verses 2, 3, and 4, and 5 define moral behavior. One last piece, and that's what I love about verse 5, because what it leads to is not a mindset, but what you do with your hands. Again, this is somebody with resources who doesn't take advantage of the poor person. And hand is implicit in 5. And that's also part of the nature of the biblical mindset of it. What does God want? God wants deeds that are worthy of tending to the needy.
Ellie.
Yes, Rabbi Podwall. And I had something I wanted to share with Rabbi Podwall in that regard. So go ahead.
Verse 2, Tamim.
Who's speaking?
Huh?
Who's speaking?
Shalom Podwall.
Oh, it was Rabbi Podwall. I did recognize your voice. Go ahead.
It says Holech Tamim, and you said that as in Noah's an Ish Tamim who walked with God.
Right.
Tamim Hayta B'Dorato. He was Tamim.
Right.
But sadly, and you said it's very popular on monuments. It says this man who passed away is Ish Yashar, is a straight shooter.
Yeah.
A man of integrity, and he's Tom, and they give it I call it a poor translation of saying he was simple.
Right.
And simple is not a positive, doesn't connote a positive quality. I'm wondering why they don't translate it, upright, instead of simple. And at the Passover Haggadah, Passover Seder, the child is a simple child, and this whole concept of being a person of integrity is lost.
I'm glad you raised this issue of how Tom often gets translated as simple. So as Rabbi Podwall notes, the 4 sons, the one that's usually called the simple son in Hebrew, he's a tam. Interestingly, in that regard, as you probably know, Rabbi Podwal, in the Hasidic commentaries, he is often seen as the most elevated of the four sons, the tam, and that he's unpretentious. He's simple in terms of he's, direct. He asks his question without any pretense. So tam, at least, and even more in the Hasidic tradition, which is true for those headstones, because they're often in the context of Eastern European Hasidic tradition, is elevated to somebody who is unassuming, unpretentious, without ego, if you will. Though, to the first part, in terms of the quote regarding Noah ish tamim, he was tam, lidorotav, for his generation, which is also to say that the word tam is not necessarily an absolute. It's have integrity relative to the time and place in which one lives. It's in that sense never pure. It has this element perhaps, at least in the way it was used with Noah, of a relative quality. But I wanted to share also with Rabbi Podwal, because with Psalm 14, he pointed out one verse from that psalm that gets incorporated into liturgy. Here, note that verse 4 gets incorporated into our Rosh Hashanah repetition of the Amidah, in whose eyes a debased person is repugnant, but who honors those who are in awe of Adonai, though swearing even with self-harm does not renege. So that our liturgy on a daily basis often has Psalms as the backbone. All of our introductory prayers, or most of them before the formal call to prayer, are reading of Psalms. But Psalms are also taken out of context, verse by verse, where it fits a motif. And so although Psalm 15 is not read as part of our liturgy, that one verse is. So I see we got 2 minutes. Coming attractions. Tomorrow, Psalm 16. And Psalm 16, what I'm showing you is what's called a Shaviti. A Shaviti is a mandala. Jews too have mandalas. We think of Buddhists who do these drawings, these mandalas to focus attention. In the Jewish tradition, we have mandalas too, and they're called Shavitis. Shaviti means I have placed God before me. Shaviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I will always place God before me. And they're done artistically. In looking at Encyclopedia Judaica, remarkably for me, because they're so familiar from synagogues, is they just started in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the 19th century in Europe, but also Morocco, are these artistic, focal points. And the line, I have always placed God before me, is one line from tomorrow's Psalm. So it'll be, I already prepared it. I'm excited to share with you tomorrow how that one line and why that one line, which is mentioned in the Talmud as well, becomes, if you will, the focal point for the mindset of prayer that will then become an artistic expression in our tradition. With that, I thank everybody, but we're going to pause. Melanie Greenberg is one of our participants today, and Melanie is in her week, just completed her week on Sunday morning of Shiva for her mother, Ethel Hamburger, and she's still in her Shloshim. So we conclude by doing the mitzvah of answering Amen to Melanie's recitation of Kaddish. If there's anybody else who is observing a yurtzeit, I invite you to join in as well. I rise as I join with Melanie in the saying of Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'alma divra kirutei yamlich malchutei B'chayeichon u'byomeichon u'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'bizman karim v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei shmei rabba mevarach le'olam omel maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei nekudsha mirichu le'ela minko birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'amiram b'yom v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba mevarach le'olam omeh omaya. Oseh shalom b'ramav hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru.
Amen.
Thank you all. I look forward to spending tomorrow 10 o'clock to 10:30 as we look at Shaviti and Psalm 16. Have a good day. Thank you for putting wind in my sails for today.